This next fight, we're going to have an all-time UFC record tied by none other than A10 Jim Miller. He's going to tie the record for most fights in the UFC at 35 with none other than Donald Cowboy Cerrone. And I'm really looking forward to this one because Jim Miller, we talked about it in the last fight. Clay Guida, wily vet, continues to carve out a great career. Jim Miller's done the same thing, and to his credit, he's been taking on very, very tough competition for the longest time. I talked about it, tons of fights in the UFC. He's been there for over a decade. And you look at his last fight, and it was a loss to Scott Holtzman in a fight that I thought he was probably going to win, and he didn't. Before that, two big wins over Jason Gonzalez, where he got a finish, and Clay Guida. And the other loss before that, Charles Oliveira. So what are you going to get here to Jim Miller? Who really knows? We'll talk about that later. He's taking on Roosevelt Roberts, who's on an absolute tear. His only loss in the UFC to Vince Pichel, a guy who can really put the pressure on. His striking's good. His wrestling's good. He's kind of good all over the place. But the wins, man. I mean, we've seen Roosevelt Roberts out not that long ago against Brock Weaver, where he absolutely outclassed him. And before that, a big win over Alexander Yakovlev, who's the type of fighter that, would I compare him to Vince Pichel on a lower scale? Maybe, but it was a big win nonetheless. And so far, Roosevelt Roberts has kind of been that next generation at lightweight, where his striking is complemented by his grappling. And there's a lot of really good aspects to his game that I think as he moves up the ranks, he's really going to cause problems for a lot of people. And I think that big first test is here with Jim Miller. Now, Roosevelt Roberts is an overwhelming favorite. He's sitting around a minus 260 right now. But I do think, and I continue to say, that Jim Miller is the perfect test. Back me up on this, please.
So I do agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I do think I'll just let my prediction be known. Roosevelt Roberts is going to beat Jim Miller. Jim Miller's going to test him, though, in a really good way. There's, these fights happen all the time where you kind of have that veteran who's a well-known, kind of established name in the division, and then these young up-and-comers. And it's very much a crossroads fight. It's kind of a played-out term at this point. I think this is the worst thing that could ever happen to Roosevelt Roberts, though, long-term in his career. Because once you beat Jim Miller, there's no easy fights afterwards. You're only fighting other big-name guys. And then the competition is going to get harder and harder because you're going to start fighting big-name guys who are still in their prime. Now, maybe he could be kind of one of those fringe top 15 guys. You look at the top 15 at lightweight, I don't see Roosevelt Roberts beating any of those guys for at least a couple more years. He still needs to he needs time to sort of round out his game a little bit. Beating the brakes off Brock Weaver doesn't really tell me that much about you. Beating Jim Miller tells me a lot about you, though. And if he is able to get that W, I think it's going to make a big difference. But again, I think it could be kind of bad for him long term because if you beat Jim Miller, let's say who could he fight next? Gregor Gillespie or something. He doesn't beat Gillespie. He doesn't beat Yancy Medeiros. Well, okay, he probably beats Yancy Medeiros. But you've got guys like Kevin Lee, Gregor Gillespie, Charles Oliveira, who are in the top 15, who are barely even in the top 10. And he's going to have to start fighting those guys relatively soon after you beat Jim Miller. And that's a big tough task to ask of Roosevelt Roberts.
You stole the name out of my mouth in Gregor Gillespie. So what about Anthony Pettis next? I mean, there's a lot of different names at 55.
Again, it's just 155 is so stacked right now that I think these prospects need a few more fights before they can even come close to the top 15. And the problem is with Jim Miller, you kind of have to make him fight one of those guys afterwards. There's no more warm-up fights. And that's the only thing that's concerning to me. I think he's going to get the win. I think he's probably going to do it in impressive fashion. I just don't really know where he goes next after this one.
Be really interesting to see what's next for either of these fighters. Let us know below in the comments who you think is going to get the win. I'm going to side with you as well, Roosevelt Roberts. I think the upside is tremendous for him, and we're really looking forward to a special card here coming up. You get a great main event in Curtis Blaydes taking on Drago, Alexander Volkov. So you're not going to want to miss that. You're going to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. As we always say, let's get into it.